Hello, everyone. I am really happy to have you here today. My name is Susan Schoenberger. I'm the Director of Communications at Hartford Seminary. We are sponsoring this program, and I'll give you a little bit of background about how that came to be. Some of you on the call are very aware of Hartford Seminary. You're part of our circle, and some of you are new to us because you probably came through David and Ruth's contacts. So welcome to everyone. I'll just explain very, very briefly that Hartford Seminary is a very unusual seminary. Our roots go way back to 1834, but we are now known worldwide as a non-denominational independent seminary with a focus on interfaith dialogue and education. So our students come from many different faiths, and that's in particular why we are interested in doing this type of program. When we all started working from home back in March, and I'm sure many of you are in the same position, we decided as an educational institution to try to figure out what we could do specifically to help people out in the field, people who are dealing with issues related to the coronavirus, related to just the times that we're in at this moment. So we started a series of these free webinars, and this is our 6th webinar. You're going to be able to find all of the other ones online. We have a YouTube channel, so if you go to YouTube and you search for Hartford Seminary, you'll be able to find them on topics such as how to conduct an online funeral, how to institute online giving for your faith community, various other topics like that. So please take a look for those because this content is free and we're really happy to share it. We're so happy that we have connected today with the Safe and Together Institute to do this topic on domestic violence, and it's a really important one. So while everyone is still logging in, again, just let us know where you're from and who you are. I'm just going to give you a few logistics before we begin. Obviously, this is a Zoom webinar versus a Zoom meeting, so we don't have everyone's faces on the screen. You're going to be seeing a presentation from us, and you'll be able to chat during that presentation, but we ask that you use a Q&A function to ask questions. So we're going to try to leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you can put those questions in the Q&A, my colleague, Stephen Havera, I don't know if he's on my left or my right on your screen, but he is our Communications and Development Associate, and he'll be moderating the questions. So if you have questions as we're going through, just go ahead and put them in that Q&A. I just want to let everybody know to remind you that we are going to be recording this. So if you missed something or you don't have an opportunity to take notes, you will be receiving a follow-up email, and everyone who registered, as well as people who are actually on the call, will receive the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar so that you can go back and get any information that you might have missed. So now I'm just going to quickly introduce our webinar leaders for today, and I'm going to turn it over to them. We have David Mandel, who is Executive Director of the Safe and Together Institute, and Ruth Stearns Mandel, who are clearly together in the same household, Communications and E-Learning Manager for the Institute. So I'm going to go ahead and let them get started. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. We're really happy to be here, and thank you to Hartford Seminary for sponsoring this event.
Yeah.
And we're really grateful for this opportunity to talk to faith leaders apparently all over the world, and folks who are also interested in outreach to the faith community. And for us, this is a really special time. Despite the challenges and the hardships, it's a time of great creativity and important activism really around this issue. So we're really excited about this conversation.
Yeah. And this is, I'm really upfront about the fact that I'm a survivor of complex child abuse. I grew up in a religious cult, and so I have a lot of trauma around the failures of religious leaders in preventing child abuse or reporting child abuse or domestic violence. So it's actually a little bit emotional for me to see all of the people that are chiming in and that they're engaged faith leaders that are trying to do the right thing and help victims of domestic violence and child abuse. And I'm really excited that you guys showed up, because showing up is the first and most important step.
So before we go to the formal PowerPoint presentation, just a couple more things about us. One is Ruth and I co-host Partnered with a Survivor, a podcast. So if you like listening to us, there's more information available through a lot of the common podcast platforms. And the backdrop for this current webinar, and Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we launched our Family and Friends Ally Guide. And this is a brand new document, and it's something new for us in terms of putting out something directly to the public. And we're real excited that Hartford Seminary looked at it and said, oh, this is something that would be of interest to our community. And we'll show you, we're really deriving a lot of this webinar from the material in this document. And this is free and it's available, and it'll be included in the email that goes out later on. So those of you who want it, you'll be able to download it. We're going to make it available through printing on our website soon, but it's not up there yet. So we'll give you all that information later on, but really want to say that we recognize that that people want to disclose. People want to talk about being abuse survivors, and that often the first people that they talk to are kin, family and friends. Now, what we'll talk about interesting is they don't always go to religious leaders. And that's something we want to kind of discuss. The data really points out some gaps there, and we'll talk about that. But that we really want to make sure that those were good experiences, because good experiences disclosing translate into safety, they translate into better mental health, they translate into stronger families. And so we're hoping you're going to walk away from this webinar with information based on this Family and Friends Guide, as well as our wider practice.
And we're just going to go back and forth. We've broken down the webinar into sections based off of our own specific set of knowledge. And David is the expertise guy, and as the executive director and the experience in domestic violence. And then I'm going to speak a bit about my experience with faith leaders and the things that seem to be barriers and common barriers to faith leaders engaging with victims and survivors in a meaningful way, which actually creates safety and accountability.
And just as we go through this, Ruth was actually the driving force behind both the podcast and the Family and Friends Ally Guide. And we feel like it's particularly important in this time when people may be less connected to formal services, that they can count on, for us, the vision is they can count on a really good response from the people who love them, the people they're connected to, the people who are their faith leaders, their faith community members, their family members. And so we're hoping that this will really help with that. So we're gonna kick off the presentation with the goals. And we hope you walk away from this webinar with an increased understanding of what domestic violence is, because it's a much wider definition than what a lot of people think. We want you to be able to describe principles of domestic violence informed response, and we'll kind of go through these. But when you think about your congregation, your community, or outreach to faith communities, you want to think about what makes for good practice, what makes for good framework. And I think this really works across different denominations and different faith organizations. So you're not getting told or a certain prescription about from a particular faith perspective. So I think this is really useful for the non-denominational framework of Hartford Seminary's audience. So I hope that's good. We'll talk about how domestic violence may present itself in your congregants, particularly from the survivor side. And then how we need to deal with barriers that might get in the way of identifying it. Some general ones and then some faith-based specific ones, both identifying and responding well. And then we'll wrap up with how do you be a good ally? And we think of allies as being people who are there as a support, who are going to listen, and then when appropriate, take action in a concrete and constructive way. And that doesn't look like one thing. So being an ally can look like lots of different things. who are we? Safe and Together Institute. If you want to check us out, you can go to the Safe and Together. You can go to safeandtogetherinstitute.com and check out our website. And we work internationally. We're based in the U.S., but we have employee in the United Kingdom. We have people across the U.S. And this is our mission. And we have a lot of partner agencies and extensive experience working in the field. This is a little bit about what we do, just so you get a sense of the scope. So in this environment, we're doing a lot of e-learning. We do a lot of training and support. So a lot of the places that people have kind of signed in from, we're doing work with state agencies, or Florida, let's say, with advocates, or North and South Carolina. So just understand that our work is really much wider than even what we're going to talk about today in this webinar. And for those of you who like maps and visual representations, quite a bit of work, and Asia actually left out Singapore, and but you can see that we actually spend a fair bit of time in Australia and across the US and the United Kingdom. So just maps are always good to give people a sense of what's going on. And for the first time this year, and again, to give you a feel for the scope of our work, this is a really conservative effort, but we train professionals, we train systems. In a lot of ways, one of the ways to think about it is we don't think that survivors are broken. And I think a lot of times people want to pathologize survivors. We're often looking at how systems are not responsive well. And we really want to change systems. And so in the last year, this is how many kids we think we've impacted through training professionals. So getting directly to the content here, we wanted to give you some stats and wanted to give you a sense of the challenges we're up against, the gap that we, and obviously those of you who are joining the call who have an interest in this topic, are trying to close. And unfortunately, that what the data shows is, despite a lot of trust that parishioners will put in their church leaders, or their imams, their rabbis, their ministers, their pastors, from different denominations, that despite that trust, despite the importance of their spiritual life, that across the board that people are saying, I'm not sure I want to disclose to those leaders about domestic abuse. And so I think we need to be a little bit reflective about the gaps and barriers here, and we hope this webinar is gonna address that. And so if you look at this, really, it's not just clergy, but it's also people are not disclosing to professionals at these high rates. When you look at the data, they're much more likely to disclose to family and friends. And the other thing is that when they did disclose, that 40% number at the bottom, it's really profound to my sense, because they said, I disclosed, but I didn't feel like I got any help. And so I think one of our requests as people who are in a position of authority in faith organizations is to say, I don't want to just wait for somebody to come up to me. How do I make my faith environment conducive? How do I make it inviting? I always talk about with other professionals, we have complete control over the half of the bridge we build to survivors. That survivor has a choice whether they step onto the bridge, but how we talk about it from the pulpit, how we frame it in premarital counseling or pastoral counseling. There's lots of ways faith leaders can signal or do signal one way or other to parishioners, I'm a safe person to disclose to or not. And so I really want people to really consider that this is part of the point of the webinar, is really to get people to reflect on have I created the safest and strongest container for people to come forward to me and say, I'm in danger, I'm being hurt, I need support from you, from the community around my safety. Okay, so we promised to lay out domestic violence informed response. And the first part of it is just laying out these key principles. And I'm going to go through them one at a time and talk about them again. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box that Ruth and I can come back to later on. So the first thing is that we need, and throughout the Family and Friends Guide, and throughout our work in general, we use coercive control as a framework versus just physical violence as a way to understand what we're looking for and how we define domestic violence. And that doesn't mean to downgrade the seriousness of physical violence, because if physical violence is accompanied at the level of stalking, it involves strangulation, it involves assault with injury, if it involves weapons, we are dealing with situations that could potentially be life-threatening. At the same time, we need to put this into the context of wider patterns of behavior. And we're going to go deeper into this. When we talk about coercive control, we're talking about a whole range of behaviors that entraps somebody, that cuts into their liberty, that makes them afraid. And so what you can have is one incident of physical violence, and then years and years of threats, intimidation, controlling finances, sexual abuse, that would never, in most situations, lead to an arrest. But the power of that physical violence combines with the other forms of control to entrap somebody and communicate it really clearly. And so when we talk about communities that are ready to look for, identify, and support survivors, that it isn't just around, did you get hit yesterday? But it's really about this wider pattern of abuse, and we'll talk about that more. The second principle really is how we clarify and have clarity about the responsibility of the person choosing violence for their own behavior. In many situations, people will use language and have an approach that somehow domestic violence arises from problems in the relationship. And one of the things we say in the Family and Friends Guide is that while all couples have problems or challenges, and that's a common course of things for pastoral counseling, that when somebody starts acting in a violent, abusive, or controlling way, that is their choice exclusively and not a result of the couple dynamic. And so communication has to be extremely clear. If you want to create a domestic violence informed organization, your communication has to be extremely clear that it's the person who's choosing violence or choosing to harm that's responsible for their behaviors and the consequences. One of the biggest barriers to survivors sharing is going to be the sense that they're going to be blamed or held accountable for the abuse, or somehow they did something wrong. So this is one of the most important things when we talk about domestic violence informed practice that really needs to be in place. You need to be able to understand the impact of and we'll talk about this, about the behaviors of the person who chooses violence on adult and child survivors, what that looks like. You need to be able to partner with that adult survivor. And this is what allying looks like. And you need to be able to listen and talk to them. And again, we'll go into more details, but partnering is key to this approach. You need to look at how your system intervenes with that person who chooses violence. If this person is a parishioner, a part of your community, they're a valued member of your congregation, we're not suggesting the only answer is to toss them out. We're really suggesting that how do you work with them in whatever ways you have possible to decrease their danger or to help them stop their behavior to others and help heal the damage that they've created. So we're talking about interventions. You can't leave the person who chooses violence out of the equation. And the last thing is really to understand that in many of these families, that bond between the survivor, that usually who's the mother, we'll talk about this a little bit further on, and the kids is so important for the kids' safety and healing. So we're giving you some principles that we're going to come back to over and over again as we go through this. So we're both going to talk about coercive control, and then I'm going to transition the next bit of this to Ruth so she can pick it up. But it's so important to really understand that coercive control is a pattern of behavior that really ends up resulting in a loss of self-determination. People have less choices when they're being controlled. Their quality of life, their satisfaction goes down. They're less happy and they feel less safe. And I remember a conversation I had with somebody who's talking about their mother, and we were talking about these three things, and she disclosed to me that her dad had tried to murder her mother when she was 2, when this person was 2 years old. And she said, the reason why I'm telling you in this professional setting that happened, because this is a risk I'm taking, is because you talked about how people choose violence and coercive control, tamp down, control people's sense of satisfaction. And she said, my father didn't let my mother sew because my mother enjoyed sewing. And I think this is really important for those who want to look for and find and identify coercive control and domestic violence, it's going to show up sometimes not as the black eye, though it may, but it's going to show up in these very, what appear to be small, minor details of control, something that just doesn't feel right, people not being able to do something they should be able to do, or having to answer. Ruth's going to go through that more, but I really want people to hear that we're talking about what's taken away from people. We have colleagues, friends, Luke and Ryan Hart from the UK, who unfortunately lost their mother and their sister to father who murdered them. And they talk about it, when you look for this, it's not just looking for what has happened, but what is taken away. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important to state that their father had never been physically violent to their mother or to them as children. He was just incredibly controlling, and incredibly controlling under the guise of safety for them, of creating an alternative family unit where they were isolated from the ills of the world, which is very similar to how I was raised, but in a religious context. And that isolation, that restriction of the ability of the members of the family to move with their own sense of free will, their own sense of liberty, is an overarching theme that I think we're going to keep coming back to in the religious context, because coercive control is the baseline by which so much abuse is springboarded off of.
Right.
And also, it's the baseline by that a lot of systemic abuse. So when I'm talking about systemic abuse, I'm talking about systems that have adopted methods of coercion in order to get populations to comply with what they feel is moral or is right. And so this tool has slowly worked its way into some communities, and it's really important for us to frame it in that sense, that if we wait for violence to be the marker, then we are really colluding with the harm of women and children. We have to go further behind physical violence in order to get this right.
I think one of the other bits of Luke and Ryan's story, which is so powerful, and there's more material from them on our website, is they only learned this after their father murdered their mother and sister, and there was an investigation. When Luke was 2 years old, I think it was Luke, he had a really severe peanut allergy, and his mother was talking about leaving the relationship, and the father wanted to really make it clear what might happen. So the father, right in front of his mother, I think his aunt, he put a peanut in Luke's mouth. And I want you to think about this for a second on a lot of levels. I think this story is really illustrative of what we're up against when we're trying to identify this and understand it. He chose, knowing his son had a full-blown allergy to peanuts, put a peanut in his own son's mouth to send a message to his wife: you can't leave me. This is what's going to happen. Your son's not safe. I will take away the things that you care about. I mean, think about all the layers of that messaging. And then force them to go to the hospital. I mean, the level of danger to Luke was so high, they had to go to the hospital. And the father didn't share what he did, and the mother was too scared to share what happened. So again, you have to get this dynamic of the person who chooses violence doesn't disclose because they don't want the consequences, and the person who's targeted doesn't want to disclose because they're afraid. So this is what we're up against. But when Ruth says there wasn't physical violence, there was still the clear communication: I could kill somebody. And Luke didn't know that was behind until the murders, didn't know that was behind what was happening. And so really we want you to understand that this pattern-based approach is so important to understand in terms of what you're looking at, because it doesn't have to present as a black eye. So we talk about this behaviors and the patterns. We need to go beyond incidences, and we need to think really widely about what coercive control looks like. And we'll talk more about this. So in the transition into Ruth's bit, wanted to show you what the family and friends guide looks like. We're really excited about it. We have our first copy of it here. So this is like a little baby that we have. So I'm gonna turn it over to Ruth to pick up the next bit.
So as we stated before, it's really important for us to not limit this to physical violence. I think that that's part of the problem that we have in the United States, where we really have a lot of incidences of high levels of harm to women and children in domestic violence, because that is our legal measure. But some of the things that you can look for is how it makes people feel. So if the behaviors of a partner make children and their partner feel less safe, limited in their choices, and all of these other side effects by their control, then we are really leading into coercive control. And the markers that you're going to use are going to be behavioral. And that is the family fearful of that person? Are they anxious about them? Does that person essentially rule the home via threats or via anxiety or via erratic behavior, which nobody can predict? So this is a really important thing to look towards. The response of child and adult victims is often ignored, and we really need to look at it, and we need to acknowledge it, and we need to name it. And what's really important is that in the United States, we've had a history of segregating domestic violence adult survivors from child survivors. And as a survivor of child abuse, religious abuse, child sexual abuse, and domestic violence, I was a victim of domestic violence. When I witnessed somebody holding a knife to a pregnant woman's throat, that was violence towards me. It was sending a message to me as a child that I must comply. And if I did not comply, this is what would happen to me. And so we really need to put those two principles together, that children who witness domestic violence suffer the traumatic consequences for years. People who choose violence don't just target their partner, although it may just be their family that they target. There are so many different ways that a perpetrator or a person who chooses violence impacts children on a daily basis. If that person batters their spouse or their partner, and the partner can then no longer care for the children, that impacts the children's quality of life. If that anxiety is carried over into their school life and they begin to function poorly, domestic violence is impacting that child's performance. So we really need to look at the factors which are emotional neglect and trauma that is being given to children via violence towards an adult partner, and not segregate the two out. So what are some of the impacts on child and adult survivors? I like to talk about impacts like side effects. I came from medical training. I trained doctors for over 7 years. And so the autonomic nervous system responds to trauma in a fairly predictable manner. And people really do have side effects from abuse. And I like to use that term because it removes the stigma of pathology or pathologizing the response, which is natural in a body. So some of these areas that you'll see people impacted are places like school, work, housing instability, mental health, physical health like autoimmune disorders, substance use, relationship, and parenting. These are side effect places of domestic violence. Now, this is a really important piece, and this is about gender double standards. We use the word he for perpetrators or those who choose violence, and we use the word she for victims. We do this because this is statistically the most likely and common scenario within a heterosexual relationship. But we also do it because we know that men's violence is more likely to be associated with physical injury, and it's a proxy for fear and control. So sometimes people get a bit dodgy about the languaging, but we very much want to honor the reality of survivors, and this is the statistical reality of survivors. Do you want to say something a bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think that we also recognize when we work with families, we work also with same-sex couples, and we do work with what's relatively rare scenario where the perpetrator who has control over the other one and heterosexual relationships is female. But really important to understand that this behavioral approach we're talking to you about is to think about these patterns of behavior and to look for them, and to also understand that one of the challenges in identifying it is in particularly environments where men are expected or told to be head of household, that it's going to often be challenging to identify some patterns of coercive control, because it may look like what people think family structures should look like. Right. And I think part of what we're seeing is gender double standards around low expectations for men as parents and higher expectations of women as parents really allows men who choose violence to avoid being held accountable and responsible for the harm that they do to families. So if families lose housing, we're also often going to look for that mother to fix it. If there's going to be parenting issues, the house isn't clean, we're often going to look at, or there's not enough food, we're often look at the mother didn't go shopping, when what we might be seeing is the impact of financial control. The last kind of example I give of this is the data is really clear that when kids are physically injured during an incident of domestic violence, when somebody chooses violence, that it's usually the survivor or the victim who brings the kids to the hospital for the help, and almost never the perpetrator. And you just think about that. Not only did the perpetrator choose to get violent, choose to harm their kids, choose to get them exposed to their violence, but they're often interfering with them getting help. And that could be physical help, it could be mental health help. So just really, this is a really important area that we need to look at.
Also, these gender double standards can keep you from seeing the strengths of survivors. If you expect that a mom is going to be doing all of the work to take care of children and to help them heal and to nurture them, and you don't put any of those expectations on the father, then you will not be able to recognize her protective capacity, because we have equated protective capacity with leaving rather than the behaviors of protection within the context of the relationship. So what are some of the barriers to identifying abuse? A lot of perpetrators or people who choose violence only choose to act violent around their family members and friends. It is very shocking for family members and friends to find out that their loved one is engaging in coercive control and abuse, and it's often not believed. And this is one of the reasons that survivors fear coming forward, because they will have to face that disbelief from a lot of different places.
And you see this in the news reports, and it's unfortunate, but so many reports of domestic violence, murder, or suicides are often accompanied by that line, which is from the neighbors or somebody else that says, well, they were such a nice couple. He seemed like such a nice guy. And I think that really gives you an idea of the way that somebody makes choices about how they behave. They can choose to act differently about colleagues and in public, and how crazy making that it can be for survivors. And so it's part of actually the coercive control that I can actually bring on my side people in our sphere, because they will have trouble believing that this person who's so nice to them is engaging in such horrible behaviors at home. And there's a phrase that I haven't heard used in a while, but it's street angel, home devil. And I don't know what culture it comes out of, but it's a phrase which really kind of describes this dynamic, which is the person who's really good in public and acts really awfully at home. So
there's a few other barriers I'm not going to read in here because we're going to repeat them in a couple of other slides. But one of the major ones is our sense that domestic violence is a relationship issue. Domestic violence is not a relationship issue. It is not a mental health issue. Domestic violence is a choice on the part of the person choosing violence to engage in behaviors which harm their family. And so we really have to place it within that context. It is also, a lot of survivors won't label abuse because they're actively working on their relationship, and they love their partner, and they love the father or the mother of their children. And so they are in and of themselves in a little bit of denial in what they're experiencing. And so we have to be very gentle with those people and show them what good relationship looks like. And then the other one is that a lot of people don't understand that particularly coercive control can continue post-separation, as well as physical battering and stalking, and often does, especially since most abusers, even if they have battered their partner, will still receive co-custody of their children. And so a woman who has been battered by a partner has to then parent with that person legally and by the law. So abuse can often continue post-separation. So what are the faith-oriented barriers? These barriers I pulled from different places, and I also pulled a lot of them from my own experience. Domestic violence can hide behind a mask of deeply held beliefs or other mainstream ideas or behaviors. And so for example, I was homeschooled, but I was homeschooled with the stated intent of creating an environment, a faith-based environment for me, where I would learn my faith and I would be surrounded by people of similar belief. And it was the deeply held belief of my family that this was the best way forward. But it also served another purpose. I never came into contact with mandatory reporters. And once we moved from the state of California to the state of Kentucky, which was more libertarian, I really never came into contact with mandatory reporters. And so I was isolated in an isolated area of the country without any contact with people that I could report to, or who could see my behaviors, or who could see my tendencies towards wanting to commit suicide or harm myself, and ask questions about why that was occurring. In communities with a strong emphasis on male-dominated family structures, it can be really hard for people to work out the presence of coercive control and domestic violence. The fundamental principle here is that those who are choosing violence feel an entitlement to do so. They feel that it serves a really particular purpose, and that they have a right to use violence and coercive control in order to achieve that goal. Whether or not it's their children acting in a particular manner, their partner behaving in a particular way, they are the ones that are managing all of that. And it's really important to put a pin in that and note that. Who is in control of all of the aspects of the household? Is it a shared responsibility? Is it a shared endeavor? Are people anxious and fearful and afraid? Also, inaccurate perceptions of one's own religious group having lower levels of domestic violence and coercive control by virtue of their faith. Unfortunately, faith does not mean that people are not violent or coercively controlling. So you have to set that aside a little bit and realize that you might need to challenge your own perceptions of your own community, that just because they have these deeply held beliefs and these very beautiful faith ideals, they may not be behaving in ways that are beneficial, or they may be behaving in ways that are harmful to their family. And then also the prioritization of marriage, the institution of marriage, over the spiritual, physical, and emotional well-being of the people within the marriage. And this is a really big one for me, because this really leaves a lot of victims in situations where they feel the spiritual responsibility to heal a person who is being violent towards them, to stay for their principles of faith, lest they feel that they will be punished by an eternal force. And this is coercion at its best. People have to be able to understand that it is the people in the marriage that are worth the dignity. They are the people who are supposed to be participating in right behaviors of love. And that is what creates a valid marriage, not the institution itself. The other one is, and I heard this all the time, and I still hear it, that forgiving will allow me to stay. Just forgiving, Christian forgiveness. And this is a bit of a bitter pill for a lot of survivors. We don't like to be told that we have to forgive our abuser, because most of the time our abuser has not actually changed their behaviors. And so it was a really liberating day for me when I realized that forgiveness was predicated on change, that one could not eternally say they're sorry and do the same things over and over again to harm and control a person and expect that they would be forgiven without changing their actual behaviors. We're very behaviorally focused. And the other one is abuse as a tool to coerce people into spiritual compliance. So we see this a lot when we look at LGBTQ and plus kids who are harmed by institutions who believe that their way of life, their way of being is immoral. And so they are going to use tools to coerce them into the behaviors that they wish them to see. When I was growing up, I remember that I was taught that my job was to get married and have as many babies as possible. And I remember women weeping when they got pregnant. And I remember saying, I am never going to be that woman. When I have a child, I'm going to be happy that I'm having a child. But it was spiritual principles that were coercing people into that control. They believed they had to do it. This was the way. And there was a lot of depression, a lot of suicide, and a lot of domestic violence in that context. So these are some major barriers that we see specifically in faith-based communities to recognizing and to engaging domestic violence victims and domestic violent people who choose violence. Do you want to take up this part?
Sure. So we're gonna move, and we've got about 8 or 9 minutes before we stop the formal part of the presentation and take questions. There's always more.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
A lot of ground to cover.
cover.
So we're good. This is graphics right out of the Family and Friends Guide, and this is you know, Ruth had talked about this, but how you look for symptoms in terms of what might be going on with somebody who's being abused. And again, for clergy who are really interested in identifying domestic abuse and seeing it, knowing what to look for, that it's going to present in ways that may be difficult and challenging. Somebody's depression may seem like the issue, but really what might be behind it may be abuse, for instance. And that people who are abused don't always present well. They're scared. They're because, like Ruth says, the side effects or the impact of the person choosing violence. They may be scattered. They may lie. So it's all these different things that are normal effects that you can be looking for. What are other signs and symptoms? Some of these are not psychological, but they're changes. Somebody disappearing from services, you know, on a regular basis, moving around, never being alone, separate from their partner. So it may present as really family togetherness. We're always together. We go everywhere together. We do everything together. He's always with me. He always wants to be with me. You know, people giving up on their dreams and plans. I mean, there's no one way it presents, because sometimes, for instance, a person who chooses coercive control may want their partner not to work, but in other instances, they may force them to work. So it's you can't really kind of pick up one thing and say, oh, that's an absolute sign. But it's really important to understand that's not just the black eyes, the bruises, but it's all these changes in behaviors and these changes in functioning that we can be looking for. And again, you'll get copies of this, so you'll have this. And that often survivors tell us indirectly, you know, that I'm going to show you a list that we put together, but it's important to understand that survivors are going to test the waters with you. They're going to see, are you a safe person to disclose? Some of the best research on trauma and abuse and violence says that people who are abused say there's a dual imperative. One is to keep it a secret, and one is to talk about it. And part of what tips the balance to talking about it, which is usually better and safer, and if it's received well, is the sense that the person who's listening is a safe person to share it with.
And you have to establish that you're a safe person to share it with. And we're going to go over some of those ways that you can establish it. These are some of the coded disclosures that survivors use in order to tell you that they're being abused, but they're not ready to say that word yet, or you're not safe enough to say that word yet. Now, what's really important is you can never assume that a survivor is going to mark you as a safe person unless you've engaged in behaviors that show that that's the case. So it's really important for us to understand good responses and responses that are less helpful. So how not to respond to disclosures. This is a list of things that probably most survivors will say that they heard as they did a disclosure. And I'm not going to go over all of them because we have truncated time. But I think that it's really important, particularly some of the faith-based ones, which are turn the other cheek, forgive. I was told that the husband is the head of the household, and therefore I had to listen to him, and that if he was unhappy, it was my responsibility. And so these are things that we hear in a faith-based context, which continue that cycle of violence and harm in families. But even more importantly, how do we respond to disclosures? So there's work that we have to do. In order to do that, we have to engage in communication and collaboration, and we need to talk, we need to ask questions. So some very direct things that you could ask are, when you say he gets angry, what does that mean? And then stop and let them tell you what that means, what that looks like, what that feels like in their family. God wants us to feel like we matter. This is a great statement for faith leaders. God wants us to feel like we matter. One of the ones that we use that's not on here, that's really within the religious context where people are trying to honor their religious beliefs, but are really working out issues of domestic violence in their families and coercive control, is how can I make you feel more safe? And how can you live your values at the same time?
Mm.
You shouldn't have to give up your values in order for you to feel safe. You shouldn't have to give up your beliefs or your religious or your social context in order for you to feel safe. This allows for us to clear the ground and say, I want you to live your values. I want you to be able to have your faith. But how can I make you feel more safe and be more safe in that context?
So the last bit before we move to questions is really concrete things, and here, this is directly out of our Family and Friends Ally Guide. You know, there's 4 things we lay out. You know, tell that person who is choosing violence that the person who is choosing violence is responsible for those behaviors. So if you're talking to a survivor, you want to make it clear, unequivocal. Don't leave it to imagination because he's told her it's her fault. Maybe her mother has told her her fault. Other people in her life may have said, well, all the things Ruth kind of laid out, you know, you should try harder, you should forgive. All those things suggest that it's her failures or her gaps that really might be causing the violence. And so this is really important.
And
Yeah.
I'd like to put a little pin in that, because we have to get to the place in our own beliefs, in our own practice, where we say that nothing,
Right.
it doesn't matter if she cheated on him.
Right.
It doesn't matter if she's abusing substances. Nothing will wave away violence and coercive control.
And what I'll say to you, who are faith leaders, who are talking to faith leaders, is the important message that anytime we're less than perfectly clear about that, we're going to actually empower the person choosing violence. And I worked with a colleague out of Vermont who said I did work with men who were violent years ago for 20 years. And we learned the same lesson, which is if you have any place in you where you can be made to believe that it was her cheating that justified his violence, or her drug use, or her lack of going to church, or not adhering to certain spiritual principles, that then justified violence and control or coercive control, then you are in fact colluding with that person. Even if they're not in the room with you, but you're talking to the survivor, you're communicating to her less than perfect clarity about who's responsible. And that's going to make that person less safe and more trapped.
And with the weight of spiritual authority behind that, that is a long-term entrapment and a very large vector of danger.
The second behavior, ally behavior, is learn more, be curious. We talked about that, and try to find out what this looks like, because it looks different in every family. And the impact is different and the significance is different. For instance, somebody who's got a child with disabilities, their vulnerabilities may be different. If they have health issues, their vulnerabilities may be different. Immigration status. And not every person who chooses violence acts in the same way. So really to understand, in some cases, you may be dealing with lethal or near lethal violence. In other cases, not to minimize it, there may be no indication that's the level it's at. So you want to learn more about what it looks like in this family. The third ally behavior is to validate all the things she's doing right for herself and her kids. And this is so important. We don't say to somebody, I see how hard you're working to keep yourself safe, and particularly your kids safe. And because if there's kids involved and the person who chooses violence is harming those kids, often the survivor feels tremendous guilt as a parent. And so you as a faith leader can really help ameliorate some guilt and say, look, I see how hard you're working. I see how you reached out. I see that when you called the police, you were trying to make things better for you and your kids, but it didn't help because the police didn't respond well. Anything you can do to validate her experience and her strengths is going to go a long way, because the person choosing violence, part of the way they gain psychological power is to make the person who's receiving the violence feel like it's somehow their fault, and they're to blame. And so breaking that power is one of the important roles you can play.
And I also want to add that you want to acknowledge and validate the survivor for even the small things that you may not have seen before. I see that when the violence started escalating, you brought the kids in the other room and you told them to lock the door and turn on the TV. This was an act of protection. It's not often recognized as an act of protection, but anybody who has grown up in violence and abuse as a child knows exactly what their parent is doing.
So, and the last thing is offer practical support. And that may look very different depending on where you are, but it could range from help with transportation, childcare, safe housing to interventions with a person who chooses violence. So there's a range of things, and it's in the Family and Friends Ally Guide. And a good response can be really helpful. It really can reduce symptoms, suicidality, depression. It's not insignificant at all.
I would like to say that it's actually quite significant, that I experienced fairly traumatic physical abuse as a child, but there was nothing more traumatizing to me than people who did not validate that, or who stood by and watched as adults and did not acknowledge that it was abuse, or as time went on, who denied that that happened. That is quite a reality upending thing for survivors, and that often leads to traumas that lead to substance abuse and suicidal thoughts.
So we're going to move toward the Q&A, and just to have on your mind, we believe that the faith organizations are uniquely placed to really be allies to survivors and actually intervene with people who choose violence. And, you know, at your disposal, you've got beliefs that are against violence and are towards peace and towards love, organizational structures that really tie people together and can be supportive, your leadership, the rituals of your community. And so there's tremendous amount of things that are available as resources. And then, you know, if you're going to pull on the Ally Guide, these are just some places where it can be really useful for you, you know, giving you messages to share from the pulpit, how you use it for premarital counseling. I can't stress this too much, both those things, as a prevention and sort of creating a safe environment to speak from the pulpit around these things. Let somebody know, both survivors and people who choose violence, where you stand. And then to braze it in premarital counseling, so it's not left up to people's imagination. Obviously bringing it into pastoral counseling, and then making something like this available in public spaces.
And I want to speak to the importance of this. We have been habituated. Part of the cycle of violence is that we have witnessed the behaviors of coercive control and domestic violence, both in pop culture, in our own families, and in music and society all around us. And we have absorbed these lessons, and we believe that they are normal relational dynamics. We believe that violence is part of the dynamic between men and women, when actually I don't believe that that's the case. And so really understanding that we have to undo our own trauma, our own cultural trauma, our own ideas about what violence is and what coercive control is, and how we speak about that and how we address it within our communities, within our families, is really, really important.
Okay, so Susan, we're gonna stop here, and we went a little bit longer than we talked about. You know, it was a lot of material to cover.
Quite all right.
At a time. We tried.
We
And
You did a great job.
So we have 5 formal minutes for Q&A, but yeah, we'll follow your lead about how you want to move forward at this point.
Yeah, I'm thinking Steve can go ahead and maybe read through the questions that we have, and if people have other questions they'd like to add to the Q&A, please go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so the first question, do you have a program that mentors abusers to change in addition to your podcasts? And
actually, we're about to release something. You know, most of our work with professionals, but we're actually about to release in the next week. It's been a week away for a while, so it should be next week for real. Monday, we're hoping. It's called our Choose to Change campaign, and it's a toolkit that actually gives men's guidance about how to set up networks. And this is really perfect. We're really hoping to package the Friends and the Family and Friends Ally Guide and Men's Toolkit to faith communities, because what it does, the Men's Toolkit says, lets people mentor men in how to pick people who they can call when they're worried about being abusive, and gives instructions for the men and for those other people and professionals, which could include clergy, about how to guide that person. So check back to our website the next couple of weeks and look at, you know, for this Choose to Change.
Right, and that Choose
network.
to Change comes with a card. It comes with a worksheet, and I also believe it's coming with a few posters and other media pieces.
That's right.
That can be used.
And there will be a podcast once it comes out in the next week or so, directed where we'll talk specifically to men about this. So it'll be a resource for men around this. And it's really important just to say that our message is underneath it all is that fathers, that men's choices and behaviors are really important to the function of the family and to the strength of the family. and that we have to have the ability to sort of identify what's good about fathering, what good behaviors are associated with it, but also talk about the unpleasant, but also dangerous and harmful behaviors without throwing somebody away, but saying, look, you matter, and the way you act matters. And so that's the kind of underlying message for a lot of that.
Sure. That kind of bridges us to another question here. How do you counter those who rationalize male coercion of women as it's our culture?
I think this is where cultures need to, look inside and say that there are features of every culture that promote peacefulness, respect, equality, don't condone violence, in fact, are against violence, particularly in the home. And I think that people really need to challenge from within their own faith or cultural community that this is not our way. I remember working with some Native American folks, and they were dealing with high levels of violence against women. And part of actually their messaging to boys and men was, this is not our tradition. They were drawing on their own faith and cultural tradition to say, no, this is not what we've done historically. And I think it's important to really understand that we can challenge this idea of male supremacy in families and still practice spiritual and cultural beliefs and practices that are consistent with that. Now, I think it's a complicated conversation that plays out in different communities in different ways.
Sure. I'm looking for something. I know you have the materials coming out next week, but another question is a pamphlet or something small that a faith leader can keep in their pocket to have a conversation.
I guess this is what Ruth is looking, going, because she's in charge of our communications. She goes, that's a great idea. We don't have it yet, but we might soon.
We are developing resources at a rapid clip. I had committed myself to making this Friends and Family Ally Guide over a year ago, but with COVID-19 and having grown up in a really isolated remote community, I knew the best chance for a lot of child and adult survivors was to ally with their family members at this point. And so we're creating a lot of resources that are free for family members. And so I'm going to put that on my list, and I'm going to hope to make it.
She actually, once she puts something on the list, it often happens. I want to get to the sort of bridge around the cultural competency question. I know that's coming up in the earlier one. We're working with a Muslim domestic violence center up in London, Ontario, and they're doing some really great work, and we're hoping that he's going to write a blog for us. But that he talks about sort of that as he works with people who choose violence, and he says, we come from, he's Yemeni, and he's coming from a Muslim perspective. He talks about collectivist frameworks and saying how important family is and community, and that oftentimes the values put over the individual. And he says he works with men who are choosing violence and says, what's negotiable and what's not negotiable, and in your faith tradition. And he'll say, though, at the same time, we won't accept this kind of behavior, violence. If there's threats to kids or threats to your partner, I may have to involve law enforcement, other people. So he works both to connect up the culture, but at the same time draw really clear boundaries around violence and abuse. And I think that kind of model is a really good one.
I think we probably need to wrap it up because we're right up against 1 o'clock. And thank you so much, Ruth and David. What an awesome webinar this was. Such amazing information, packed with so many resources that we will also, again, share with everybody. So maybe we can go to that last slide if you have that. Is there the Hartford Seminary?
Yeah, just to say before I do that one, to say that if people want to reach us afterwards,
yes,
this is the way to reach us. This is all our kind of information. And also, if you want to go to somebody asked about training, we have a virtual academy, and it's academy.safeandtogetherinstitute.com. So again, I'll say that again, academy.safeandtogetherinstitute.com. And we have a lot of free resources, but also training, high quality online training. And we're offering a discount of 15% for anybody on this webinar with a code HSCT. So Hartford Seminaries, Connecticut, HSCT. If you put it in, it'll apply to everything except our virtual core, which is a longer course. And just, it's
Well, it will
available.
apply to the 4 foundational courses.
Yeah, to the 4 foundational courses you see on there. So again, we really want to offer it up as a thank you to everybody who came onto this webinar. And here, Susan, oops, we don't have the slide.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Oh, that's
No.
okay. That's okay.
I am
No
sorry.
problem. That
Yeah.
is not a problem at all. The only, we just put a slide together so that I could mention to people that we would love to have you check out our website, heartsem.edu. We should have our fall courses listed on there within the next week or so. We are thrilled that we can do these webinars, and some of that has been supported by donors. So when we send out that follow-up material, we'll send you a link, and if you would like to make a donation to support us doing more of these kinds of webinars, this today is such a great example of super practical information, really right on topic to what people are dealing with today, and such really excellent references and materials that we can all use and share with other people who are doing, all of this good work in our communities. So thank you again to David and Ruth. We're thrilled to have you. We hope we can do more with you. And thank you to everyone else for coming. I do see just a quick question. How long will the code be available?
I'm going to leave it up for about a year.
A year. Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you again, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Hope to see you again on another webinar.
Thank you all. Thank you,
Thank you.
Susan. All
Take
right,
care.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.